We will be entering into the title of this session a little later, but as we walk towards that, I mean, maybe it's interesting to kind of speak a little bit about Kerala and biennial making, just to give an introduction that how certain survey projects evolve in becoming a very strong, inclusive, site for, different kinds of participation. So, to start with, I just want to kind of make a little bit, some kind of a remark on Kerala. In recent times, you see that, Kerala is becoming more and more a site of dissent, culturally, politically, and in multiple ways. Kerala is becoming a site where there are different kinds of protests against the social system is also generated. So me being part of one organization which initiated the Kochi Moses Biennial, I thought it is interesting to kind of speak about the contribution of biennials in understanding the cultural context of Kerala, Kerala's history of celebrating diversity, multiculturalism, and also a project centered around a place like Kochi, Matancheri, where there is more than 35 different communities living together in a 2-3 kilometer square, almost as an extension of a port city, like a larger microcosm of a larger India. So the reason I was mentioning Kochi is there is always a role biennials play nationally and also internationally in doing survey projects, in curating to the context, responding to the politics of the time. So in that context, we have, we are all actually waiting for one of the oldest biennial, the Venice Biennial this year, which will be opening on April 17th, as a very interesting way of curating the next edition, which is also connected with today's conversation in many ways. I'm sure, Elone sir will be able to kind of walk us through the positive outcomes of thinking the way the Venice Biennial is, trying to kind of bring this edition, together. So the title of the Venice Biennial this year is Foreigners Everywhere. And it is curated by Adriano Pedrosa. In the history of, the Venice, the Biennial, it is the first time a Latin American curator is invited to curate. And interestingly, in a time where, even in India, we had a lot of issues around, NRC and CAA. There are a lot of protests which happened in this country, but globally you see that there is a crisis. There is a floating migrant community. It's a lot of refugee crisis. We also saw in Europe multiple discourse around the ethnicities and diversities. So the titling of this edition of the biennial actually opens up foreigners everywhere. Questions the whose world it is, and so it actually crisscrosses many discourses. So in this, maybe as a introductory remark, I thought I would like to kind of listen to the initial remarks around the idea of curating something on foreigners everywhere. And before I hand over the mic to Professor Elone, I also want to kind of give you a gist of what some of the few highlights, starting by saying that 80% of the artists in the upcoming Venice Biennial, they are not alive. you know. So there's a certain notion of like, I mean, looking back into history, what was produced earlier, which was excluded from international exhibitions. Maybe with that question, like, I mean, I'll hand over the mic to Professor Elone first to respond to these kind of premises, where international projects, curated projects, survey projects invites us to kind of, maybe even open up our minds. So,
thank you. Thanks for inviting me, and thanks, Riyas. When we at an international level, when we talk about the biennales or biennials, we also need to keep in mind that there are there are there are national context and there are international context. Both things simultaneously exist in biennales, and at the same time, one also has to see the choices, the kind of a choices the curators are making, or what statement they would like to propose. Now the exist uh, the Venice one is going to be an example of showcasing the Indian artist in a different way, and in a way there is also a sort of recognition to the Indian modernist. And we also have a special show on M.F. Hussain, the most celebrated painter of India. And it's very sad that at the end of his life, at the end of his days, he had to leave country, live elsewhere, and he went on producing works even then. Now, when we see even a master painter like M.F. Hussain, the most celebrated painter of India, I must say, and the most famous painter in India, he is the only painter in India whose paintings were exhibited along with Picasso in Paris. And when his exhibition was there in Paris, Picasso had a tremendous capacity of absorptions. He absorbed Husseinesque line in his painting. After that exhibition, you see Picasso's artworks, you will find Husseinesque line. So that was the kind of a power Hussein had. And in return, what did we give him? It's a matter of shame on every citizen of Republic of Government of India that Hussein had to leave country. He was hounded like anything. And for doing what? That also needs to be questioned. And that brings us a very important political question of freedom of expression and the ways in which the artists are being hounded on the issue of freedom of expression. They are the worst. They are the worst people, whether it is writer or it is a painter. And so far, all the governments in power could not formulate any kind of a laws that will protect the fundamental right of freedom of expression. So we suffer from this kind of a legalities. When it comes to Venice Biennale, which and Kiran Nadar Museum has made a special provision to showcase M.F. Hussain as a nomad, and you may not agree with Hussain some of the paintings, because though being modernist, and even for that matter, all the modernists in India, despite being modernist, they also were product of the Brahmanical cultural nationalism. So Hussain is not an exception. He was also product of Brahmanical cultural nationalism. And the language of modernity, modernity is always all about formalism. That is what had happened in Europe. However, European modernity was having its roots in the social modernities. That is not the case in India. In India, the modernities, like it entered under the backdrop of the colonial rule, and the ways in which certain norms then started getting redefined. At an as an artistic practices or as an art practices, you will observe that the ethos of carrying forward those mythic imageries and the paintings that were centered around most of our religious contents, they become part of the modernist agenda, and they very much become integral part of the modernist agenda, and that's the reason I call that they become part of the Brahmanical cultural nationalism. And at the same time, one also has to see that, as Riyaz has said, that most of the artists, 80% of the artists are no more, they are not existing now. But they are going to be the one who are about whom the Biennale will, the Venice Biennale will address, represent those artists and also the works of Indian artists. Though it is a matter of pride, I mean the many of the progressives, they internationalize themselves, and they did it quickly. Whether it is Raza, whether it is Hussain, whether it is person like Souza, and even other Bombay artists like Akbar Padamsi, though was not part of the progressive artist group, but was very much there along with them, and he also internationalized himself. So this process of internationalization was very much there, and the modernist in India, especially the Bombay modernist in India, were responsible in internationalizing the modern Indian art actually. So that is very fundamental contribution that you are addressing to to an international audience, and it is also a response from their side to the international art practices.
Yeah, like the influence of Western modernism
Yes.
in an Indian context. So just for the, uh, uh, for the benefit of the audience, like, I mean, it is important to kind of, to just maybe give away a little bit more of an information, though the biennial is 2 months away. As so they are actually showing uh, an artist like, Professor Elone was saying that, who has contributed quite a bit into, Indian modernism and also the history of the progressive movement. So, politically speaking, the participation of, some of the members of the progressives into Venice also invokes a certain notion of a Nehruvian, cosmopolitan legacy, which was also part of the nation building, because when we got independence, we got a scattered country in hand. So the unification process, art played a big role in that. Many of our institutions played a big role in that. So this, this discourse also triggers a memory. So that's one interesting thing, when you bring back artists who are not, who've never got an international platform into a kind of larger discourse. In the context, the Indian list is an exception, Elone sir was saying, because they were also involved in, international practices. The artists include Jamini Roy, Amrita Shegal, Ram Kumar, B. Prabha, Raza, Souza, Bhupan Kakka. And another interesting entry into the Venice Biennial is the famous, Charles Correa's wife, Monica Correa, who was very much involved in textile, and she worked along with Pupul Jayakar. There was a movement in Bombay, the Weavers Center. Most of the artists survived through, working in, many artists like K.G. Subramaniam. If you take, bigger names, like including Gopal Adivrekar, who was a Bombay abstractionist, you see that. So it also invokes, because Venice Biennale responds to craft, indigenous art practices, pure art practices plus textile as a medium which has influenced even the pop art culture, which dominated, later. And only one contemporary entry into the Venice Biennial is the Aravani project. They are a queer group. I mean, they work, among the LGBT communities. It's very interesting. Like, I mean, the artists who were excluded from, the mainstream is, getting into it. Like Sir was talking about Rubina Karode's, very, important curation into the Venice Biennial, where Hussein going to get represented, somebody who died in exile, but his languages, his representation, his motives, I mean, his subject matters, also, like, I mean, takes a lead, to trigger a new, conversation around somebody who, grew up in Pandapur, where we have Jnaneshwar and, like Tukaram and those kind of traditions. So, I mean, I'm also looking at Hussein's presence in Venice parallelly as a, curated museum project by, Kiran Nadar Museum, becomes a very interesting argument traveling from India, which addresses, the certain notion of, freedom of expression, plus, the crisis of art, which hopefully, like, I mean, which will start, evolving in front of us. So, moving further to the context of this conversation, so we were trying to kind of do it as a kind of an introductory remark, because it's important that, a biennial which we are looking forward is going to have an impact, because it's first time, a Latin American curator coming into play, and Adriano Pedrosa is somebody who's very close to Indian art world. He's a regular in Kochi Muziris Biennial. So, returning from that, the site of confluence, I mean, we are coming to a site of, discourse around exclusions, which has happened also in the period of Indian modernity. And also in a current contemporary art world, it happens in the premises of curation. Priorities are different, like aesthetic inhibitions of people are very different. So I just want to kind of start by asking, like, I mean, what do you mean by, protected ignorance? So maybe, I mean, I think everybody must be very curious about, I mean, why this terminology?
This is actually it's a term which has been coined by me, and it has a certain meaning. It carries certain meaning and also carries certain explanation. So to make it very simple, how do I explain protected ignorance? Say, for example, a professor of physics gets up in the morning and pours water to sun, despite knowing the fact that water will never reach to sun. This is a fantastic example of protected ignorance. Now I'll explain you theoretically. The philosophers always say that rationality is always relative, and I accept that argument. Yes, rationality is relative. However, I argue that its relativeness depends on its objective. If the objective of rationality is to ward off ignorance, it becomes righteous rationality. And if the objective of the rationality is not to ward off ignorances and maintain those ignorances, then it becomes unrighteous rationality, and consequently it becomes protected ignorance. So the objective of the knowledge production has to be understood, whether the knowledge that is being produced is really warding off your ignorances or it is protecting your ignorances. Because the texts that are being produced these days, what their objectives are, and even including works of art. So how many our art practices are really aimed at killing those protected ignorances? Or even for that matter, when it comes to the art practices, I always maintain that there are people in India who are not interested in the transcendental aesthetic practices. There are. The worst is that our art historians and the critics, they will not recognize this particular aspect of anti-transcendentalism. So the metaphysics of transcendentalism is one which is completely set aside by those creative artists, and they practice art, they produce artworks, and they also produce a certain kind of a thought process, and that thought process somehow does not get addressed, precisely because in India largely the ideas are being ruled, the practices are being made on the logic of the Vedantic. And therefore, you will observe that there are a number of organizations working in India. It becomes very difficult for anyone when somebody takes a very non-Vedic position, somebody takes a very anti-Vedantic position. So you have to understand this politics of thinking. You also need to understand this politics of philosophical positioning, and consequently then you see whether the artists are following that Vedantic logic or they are going against that Vedantic logic. Or even for that matter, the number of people we revered, like say for example like Tagore, like Gandhi, or Vivekanand, or Arvind Ghosh, or even J. Krishnamurti, and all these people which we revered as philosophers, they are basically Vedantics.
The loop.
And you have to understand that the protected ignorance is all about interrogating these kind of ideas and these kind of practices. So that's how I came up with this term. It is basically rooted in the Buddhist logic of pratitya samutpad. I don't see any theoretical or a philosophical tool we have in India than the logic of pratitya samutpad, that is theory of dependent origination or interdependent origination, which has a power and capacity to interrogate every aspect of the phenomenon, including the so-called postmodernism. And one has to see whether even those kind of postmodern practices are really aiming at killing protected ignorance or not.
Yeah. I mean, extending to what you just explained, Professor Alona is somebody who's been practicing theory in through an institution like JNU, but since last few years, I think he's actually taken a very confident step and decisive approach to curate, because it becomes somebody scholarly like him, who follows Ambedkarian aesthetics and traditions and culture, also studies Buddhism, and also he has a very strong interest in he's an agenda expert, and so he does multiple things. So sometimes we also looked at him as a new curatorial mind, which is also going to kind of argue for the artists who are pushed into the margins, art which emerges from the current socio-political possibilities. So what you are actually seeing is a recent project which is going on in Delhi. We will come to that little later. But I would like to kind of pose a question, where at the time of the last edition of the biennial, you curated, a special projects, which was actually under the title Dismantling Aesthetics of Inhibition. and documenting the differences. I'm sure, the title says it all. Is it possible for you to kind of, walk us through a little bit why you included certain artists? I mean, you also had Malayali artists into it, like Sajan Mani, Vinuvi, and, there are a few other projects. But you also did a survey, a very, tight selected project. It'll be interesting, maybe before we go into Vikrant Bisay's work, speak a little bit about that.
Sure. Actually speaking, I've been working on the the first thing as an art historian or as a thinking person. I first wanted to produce a critique of Indian modernity. Can Indian modernity be critiqued? And on what grounds we can critique Indian modernity? See, the Indian society is a caste society. It's a hierarchical society. It is a society with lot of contradictions and conflicts. And in a similar way, we also have cultural contradictions and cultural differences. So I call it as Brahmanical modernity. Indian modernity is so much Brahmanical. Why I say so? When you go and excavate the history of modernity, you will notice that the cafe culture we started in Mumbai, they started on a caste line. And this is very much evident and proved in Professor Umesh Bagade's work. Like the Parsis will have their own cafe, the Chitpavan Brahmins will have their own cafe, the Bohras will have their own cafe, the Marwadis will have their own cafe. So all this cafe culture, which started in Mumbai, which we call it as a cosmopolitan city, it started on the caste lines. This is very much evident. And then the issue of caste and hierarchy never gets addressed in the Indian modernity. This becomes extremely problematic. The other important aspect of the modernity is that it is a notion which is getting adopted without dismantling your own self. You see, self is very important. How do you understand self? Self can only be understood by becoming non-self, and non-self can only be understood by becoming self. So it is a process which is very much interdependent. And then we also need to see how many intellectuals in India have really managed to dismantle their own self. Because as a person who is associated with the knowledge production, or for that matter any kind of a thought and all those things, I have not seen people presenting a critique of a self. That includes even likes of Romila Thapar or even Ramchandra Guha, celebrated historians, or even for that matter the philosophers, or even the political thinkers. I have not seen that. Why that power does not come? Whereas in the Western modernity, the people have acquired that kind of a power and criticality. Whereas in India, they have not acquired that kind of a power and criticality. And when likes of Hussain takes up some of the themes which are very interesting, which in a way attempts to interrogate, but at the same time becomes part of that Brahmanical cultural nationalism. So we have number of those modernists in India, or even the entire art practices, where I observed that they have not been able to dismantle their inhibitions. Why they cannot dismantle their inhibitions? Precisely because they believe in the normative. The normative never gets critiqued in India. And it is applicable to your everyday life, everyday thinking. This kind of a normative becomes thickly embedded in the minds of the Indians, and therefore it becomes very difficult for them to come out of their inhibitions. And without dismantling those inhibitions, I don't think you can move forward. I don't think that you can really make a statement where you can claim that yes, I am a liberal self, or for that matter, that we are very much liberal and a very inclusive and a just society. So it is from that point of view I coined this term, the dismantling of aesthetics of inhibitions, and then saw those practices, and I observed that like it is they are very much inspired by Ambedkarian thinking. So, so that's how I call it as Ambedkarian aesthetics, and I defined it I tried to define that term, and I defined it as follows. The term Ambedkarian aesthetics is a world free from prejudices, inhibitions, and meta-narratives of Brahmanic modernity. Its historical trajectory is to subvert the narrative of the given and propose to get into process of dismantling many inhibitions that have been nurtured over a period of time. Historical past, both ancient and modern, are constant reminders of ideas of contradictions that have been part of lives, including the life of works of art. For many, it is a constant engagement to kill protected ignorance. And in that particular exhibition, it like the it was cutting across the caste lines. It's not that only particular set of communities are there or particular set of religious communities are there, but it's an exhibition which cuts across the caste lines, across the religious lines. So there are people in India who have a different thinking, and their aesthetical practices you need to map and put a voice in a different way. So it is from that perspective I curated that exhibition project, which also included your works, and also included some of the one of the Kerala artist work like Sajan Mani, and even I very much wanted Venu's work to be there, but somehow I couldn't contact him, and then last moment it did not happen. But there are interesting Kerala painters who are engaging themselves in presenting this critique of social modernities, and also the practices of caste that are being followed by the dominant communities, or even for that matter, let me also say, the disease of untouchability lies with the touchable communities, but the medicine is being administered to the untouchable communities. So this is a contradiction we have. Actually, medicine needs to be administered to the touchable communities in order to come out of their syndrome of untouchability. Untouchable doesn't require any medicine for that. But it is happening vice versa. And these kind of, suddenly it becomes exclusionary kind of a tactics, which was opposed by Dr. Ambedkar and which was opposed by the Ambedkarian thinking. And there are painters who are completely disagreeing to this kind of a syndromes, whether it is untouchability, whether it is a domination of a gender, whether it is feudalism, whether it is issues of the liberty, whether it is issues of the dissent, whether it is issues of making a protest, or for that matter your everyday political and social realities. So there are sensitive painters in India who have come with this kind of a thought and also have shown their resolve in the Constitution of India. But they do not become part of the narrative of any criticality. And that is where even what Riyas has produced around the national emblem, all those works, which are very interesting. So there are people who got engaged with these kind of ideas, and their engagement is all about dismantling their own inhibitions. So they come out of their inhibitions, and without coming out of those inhibitions, I don't think you can have a very open-mindedness and open-minded creativity.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, as Professor speaks, I think you have the images of, the young artist Vikrant Bese, in the loop. So actually, I think we are running short of time. So before we open to the audience for Q&A, I would like to kind of ask one more question, which revolves around the new emerging trends in India, where the Ambedkarian aesthetics, also the discourse around constitution, is, you must have seen that. I mean, it has started reflecting very interestingly among many artists. So, in that context, I mean, as Alone sir writes a very beautiful essay on Vikrant Bise in the catalog. He uses, maybe a language which, which is very inspirational for many youngsters, who also live in those kind of social conditions and, maybe lives or pushed into the margin. So he writes, before he introduces Vikrant Bise's work into the catalog, he says, there is a new sense of consciousness that has come from Ambedkarian thinking, resulting in reflective realization. It's a very interesting term, reflective realization, as a means of intervention in producing artworks, interrogating caste through pictorial signifiers. You must have, as I read through, you must have experienced reflecting it in Vikrant Bise's work. So I just thought maybe, if you could explain that, there's two terms that which you have brought in. One is an individual having a very strong reflective realization. It makes him confident to tell his stories, the stories of his surroundings, his belongings, his communities, his struggles, that gets pushed in. At the same time, how do you create this new pictorial signifiers? Whether it is reflecting on Indian constitution or Indian social realities or symbolisms or, pictorial languages which was used in Indian art world, and what is the new which is included. So I'm also saying it because you see a very strong interest internationally in giving spaces in some of the best magazines, some of the best institutions, some of the universities have started giving a lot of attention to kind of Ambedkarian aesthetics. They've started recognizing him as a thinker, philosopher, economist, emancipator, not just the man who emancipated the Dalit community in India or somebody who was the chairperson of the Constitution drafting committee. So it's changing. There's a new aesthetics, where there's a lot of new confidence which is emerging. And the West, especially institutions, have started looking into as the new literature emerging about, maybe a certain kind of a, dialogue which was suppressed earlier. So how do you look at it, and where is that, where are these youngsters heading to? Is our institutions, our art colleges are going to kind of engage in this kind of new possibilities of education? Just, if you can elaborate before we open it up.
The term reflective realization is basically is all about consciousness, how you build your consciousness, and through the process of your consciousness, consciousness is of several kinds. And I'll just put you things in nutshell. Say, I have observed that India has three distinct achievements. That we are a fantastic labor supply country, we are a Mithyavadi Sanskriti, and we are a Vitambanavadi Sanskriti. Vitambana is the defamation. So you defame anyone, you lynch anyone, you kill anyone, you abuse anyone, you do all kinds of practices in everyday life. So we have these three distinct achievements, and we don't really try to see the problems in it. How it is disempowering the citizen of Republic of Government of India to realize the ideals that are there in the Constitution and the preamble of the Constitution. So it is all going against the practices which are there in the preamble. And how senselessly we follow those practices. So it is a consciousness of senselessness that is being followed. Now, the reflective realization is realization of this consciousness of senselessness and killing that consciousness of senselessness to become righteously conscious and realize one's power and ability to think differently and to propose a statement. See, when I go to social science seminars, as an art historian, I am always asked this question: how much your art practices are part of the political democracy? And it becomes very difficult to answer because we have very few people who have produced works around those things. So there are a new set of people who are thinking on those lines, and they have started, realizing this particular aspect and making their aesthetic practices or art practices completely different. And so they are bringing in their own story, they are bringing in their own perceptions, they are also bringing in the resolve in the constitutionalism and the plurality and the idea of the compassion, which is a part of the fraternity. And that is how Ambedkar had defined that fraternity is all about compassion and not just a simple bandhutva. So these are the elements which are then given a pictorial signifiers. So they are evolving those pictorial signifiers very differently. And likes of Vikrant Bhise has brought in so many things in his paintings. There is a history, there is a self-perception, there is also an understanding of the society, there is also an understanding of how you present yourself a certain cultural ethos, and that is all gets reflected in his work.
As a part of a bigger celestial power, do you believe in God, sir? How do you explain things relative to the concept of God?
The concept of
God, the belief of God, that existence of God.
Huh.
How do you explain it? You mean to say that it's a part of protective ignorance, or?
It is part of protected ignorance. If we go by the ideas of rationality, so your rational self does not really help you to believe in this kind of concept of divinity. So belief in divinity and sacred is all part of the Vedantic logic, and not to believe in divinity and sacred is all about coming out of the protected ignorance and believe in the rational self. So there are two kinds of people in India. That is why I said it is all about the Vedic and the non-Vedic.
So
Upanishads are also part of the Vedantic logic. Yeah, the Brahma Sutra, you can see that. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Thanks for the point.
Yeah. And also, I said those thinkers are part of the Vedantic logic. Ambedkar, Phule becomes exceptional. Well, there are youngsters who wish to make their art practices very different and also get into a different kind of a pictoriality. So the idea of newness in art, I think, has also to be judged on it's not just the materiality of material, because what I call global is all about materiality of material, which completely decontextualize everything, and it remains a simple material practice. But there are artists who are going beyond materiality of material. So their intervention is not all about material, but their intervention is all about how you contextualize that materiality into certain pictorial signifiers, and make a statement and make a political statement and a resolve in the idea of equality, liberty, fraternity, and the society which we really wish to envisage. So these are the kind of resolves which are there, even for that matter, this kind of thinking or this kind of concepts are not taught in the art school. The art schools are equally ghettoized, let me tell you very clearly. Or even the art history departments in India are totally ghettoized. There are very few exceptions like Baroda or JNU, where the new ideas, the new thinkings are always taught, and we are also part of that system. But otherwise, they are not addressed at all. And then in the educational institutes, unless until you address those issues, you tell the youngsters, they will not get sensitized. So it is a larger part of the sensitization project which everyone has to carry forward. It's not just responsibility of the few, but it becomes the responsibility of every citizen of Republic of Government of India.
Yeah, we have actually 5 more minutes maybe, so I'm just making use of his presence here. He's come all the way from Delhi to talk to us. So you've made a very interesting remark, about the art in the Constitution. There are a lot of further studies and research going on now, that when Nehruvian government approached Nandalal Bose to produce, or design the Indian Constitution, also inviting Prem Bihari Nara and Raizada to kind of calligraph it. We got 26 illustrations into the Constitution, and which has a certain chronology, starting from Indus Valley to the repeal image where a violent ship in the sea. Then we have Gandhi in Navkali and many things. But you made, when we had a long discussion, that you made a remark that Indian Constitution illustration, that art making was a revivalist project.
Yes.
Can you maybe just make few remarks on it?
It was very much a revivalist project. If you see the entire selection of the thematics and those pages, it was very much part of the revivalist project. And the entire Bengal school was part of the revivalist project. And it is very much reflected in that constitution. And not that, person like Ambedkar was in agreement with those kind of things, or the people who were in the process of making constitution really endorse those kind of things. So it becomes an exclusive decision of the particular ministry which employed those artists, and nothing to do with many of the makers of the constitution itself. However, it is a historic document. Constitution is a document of collective wisdom. It's not one person doing everything. It's a document of collective wisdom. Now what the new artists are doing, or the youngsters are doing, they are looking at it very differently. They are not looking at it in a celebrative mode, but they are looking at it at a critical mode. And that is where I observed that two people, mainly Ranjita Kumari from Patna and Vikrant Bhise, simultaneously picked up the preamble page and started producing art on it and making variations on it. So these are very interesting interventions, and that has also triggered a lot of others to think on those lines and produce art around the Indian Constitution, which was never a part in the thinking of the Indian artist earlier.
Yeah. So on that note, I think we happily conclude this session. Thanks again, Ka,